Gacha stories are not slow in the same way long-running anime are slow, and I think that difference matters a lot more than people give it credit for. A while ago, I saw a comment on one of my videos comparing gacha storytelling to long-running anime, and at first, I understood the point. Both take years to unfold, both build towards a bigger conflict, bigger antagonist, and bigger reveals, so on the surface, the comparison makes sense. But the more I thought about it, the more that comparison started to bother me. Because yes, long-running anime can be slow, One Piece is slow, Naruto takes its time, and Detective Conan might be one of the slowest mystery stories ever created, but somehow those stories still feel like the conflict is constantly moving. And that's where I think a lot of gacha stories struggle. They're not just slow, they often feel like the conflict is standing still while the story waits for the next big reveal. Wuthering Waves is probably one of the clearest examples of that. After almost 2 years, it has a lot of story, lore, and setup, but when it comes to its antagonist and the actual movement of the conflict, that's where things get complicated. The interesting part is that this might finally be changing, with Phrolova returning, new Fractsidus characters entering the picture, and the new Federation possibly bringing a different kind of conflict. Wuthering Waves might be reaching the point where its conflict finally becomes more dynamic. But to understand why that matters, we need to start with the comparison itself, because long-running anime and gacha games may both move slowly, but they don't use that time the same way. Let's make the comparison more concrete. If we look at the long-running weekly anime across roughly 2 years, we're talking about somewhere around 100 episodes. Now, is that the perfect one-to-one comparison with a live service game? Of course not. A weekly anime and a gacha game are built differently, but it does give us a useful question. After 2 years of story, how much has the conflict actually changed? This is where the comparison started becoming interesting to me. When I looked back at some of the most famous long-running anime, I didn't find stories where the main conflict was moving at lightning speed. That was never the point. What I found was something else. The main conflict could move slowly, but the conflict in front of the audience kept changing. Take One Piece for example. By around episode 100, the story has already moved through the East Blue saga and deep into the Alabasta saga. When I looked back at that stretch, what stood out to me wasn't just the number of arcs, it was how different each conflict feels. Morgan, Buggy, Kuro, Don Creek, Arlong, Smoker, Barak Works, and Crocodile are not doing the same job in the story. Some are local threats, some are personal conflicts, some are corrupt authorities figure, some expand the world, some turn the story into conspiracy, and Crocodile eventually turns that conspiracy into a national crisis. That's the important part. The audience is not waiting for the real story to begin. The real story is already happening. It's just changing shape from one arc to the next. That's why One Piece can afford to build its larger world slowly. The mysteries can wait because the immediate conflict is already doing its job. Naruto does something similar, but in a different way. By episode 100, Naruto has already gone through the Land of Waves, the Chunin exams, the Konoha Crush, and the search for Tsunade arc. And when you lay those arcs next to each other, you can see how much the conflict escalates. Zabuza and Haku give the story its first serious moral conflict. The Chunin exams turn everything into a pressure cooker. Orochimaru completely changes the scale of danger. Gaara becomes a terrifying mirror of what Naruto could have become. Then the village itself gets attacked. And after that, the search for Tsunade shifts the conflict again towards legacy, leadership, and the future of the village. So even while the larger world is still expanding in the background, the immediate conflict never feels empty. There is always something active in front of us. And then you have Detective Conan, which is almost its own category entirely. The black organization can disappear into the background for long stretches of time, and yet the story still works. Why? Because the black organization is not carrying the entire show by itself. Almost every episode or every short case gives us a new mystery, a new culprit, a new motive, and a new conflict to solve. So even when the main plot barely moves, the audience is still getting complete stories again and again. That's what makes the long-form structure work. The central mystery can take its time because the present is not empty. That's the part people sometimes miss when they compare gacha stories to long-running anime. Yes, anime can be slow. Yes, anime can take years to reveal the big picture. But those stories usually fill that time with active conflict. Arc villains, local problems, shifting dynamics, antagonists who affect the present story instead of only existing as future setup. That's why the slow burn feels earned. It works because the immediate conflict keeps giving the audience something to hold on to while the larger story builds in the background. This is where the comparison with Wuthering Waves becomes a lot more complicated. So let's look at Wuthering Waves directly. After almost 2 years, how much has the central conflict actually changed? On the surface, the story has moved a lot. We went through Huanglong, Rinasita, and Lahairoi. Each region brought new characters, new themes, new emotional moments, and its own local identity. So it's not like nothing happened. A lot happened. But when I look at the central conflict, I keep coming back to the same issue. The story has moved. The conflict has mostly stayed on the same track. It's still Fractsidus, it's still the larger hidden plan, it's still the Grand Architect moving pieces from behind the curtain. The region changes, the emotional angle changes, the characters around the conflict change, but the conflict itself often feels like the same thing wearing different clothes. And again, that is not automatically bad. A long-running story can absolutely build around one central conflict. The problem is that if your main conflict is going to be this focused, then the story needs variety somewhere else. That's where Wuthering Waves starts to struggle. Even inside that one-track conflict, the antagonist side does not feel diverse enough yet. Think about the major antagonistic figures Wuthering Waves has introduced so far. Kar, Phrolova, Cristoforo, the Grand Architect. That's already a pretty small list for almost 2 years of story, but the bigger problem is not just the number, it's the role most of them play. Scar appears as a mysterious Fractsidus figure pulling strings in Huanglong. Phrolova becomes the emotional center of the antagonist side, but even her role is still tied to manipulation, hidden plans, and a Fractsidus moving in the background. Cristoforo also functions through the same sense of mystery and control, and the Grand Architect is basically the highest expression of that idea, the mastermind above everything. So even though these characters are different as individuals, their function inside the conflict often overlaps. They are mostly variation of the same antagonist role, the hidden planner, the manipulator, the person behind the curtain. And after a while that creates a problem. If the conflict itself is already not very diverse and the antagonists inside the conflict are also playing similar roles, then the story starts to feel narrower than it should. You are not just missing different villains, you are missing different kinds of pressure. Where is the antagonist who openly challenges Rover? Where is the rival force with a completely different goal? Where is the enemy who disrupts Fractsidus instead of serving it? Where is the local power structure that becomes a problem on its own? Where is the antagonist who changes the rules of the arc the moment they enter? That is the kind of variety long-form stories need, not just more names, more functions. And this is where the slow burn argument comes in. Because I know the response some people will have, the story is still building, the antagonists are being saved for later, the big reveals are supposed to take time. And sure, I agree with that to a point. Wuthering Waves doesn't need to reveal everything about Scar, Phrolova, Cristoforo, Fractsidus, or the Grand Architect immediately. That would probably make the story worse. But slow burn should not mean everyone stays in the same narrative position for 2 years. That's where I think the excuses stop working. You can build an antagonist slowly while still making them active. You can keep their backstory hidden while still giving them different roles in the conflict. You can save the big reveals while still letting them clash, fail, adapt, change strategy, or create pressure in the present. The issue is not that Wuthering Waves is taking its time. The issue is that too much of its antagonist side feels like it has been waiting in the same position, waiting for the story to finally say, okay, now you matter. For a long-form story, that's risky, since conflict is not only about what the enemy plans to do someday, it's about what they are doing now. That's what keeps the world feeling alive while the larger mystery builds in the background. It's also the part Wuthering Waves still needs to improve by making its antagonist side more diverse, more active, and more present in the story we are already watching. Because the pieces are there, the potential is there, and with where the story seems to be heading next, this might finally be the moment Wuthering Waves starts using them differently. This is the frustrating part. Wuthering Waves already has the pieces. That's why this problem bothers me so much. If the world was boring, this would be easy to dismiss. If the antagonists were empty, this would be a completely different conversation. But that's not the case. Wuthering Waves has strong lore, interesting antagonists, cosmic threats, political regions, mysterious factions, personal tragedies, and enough world building to push the story in a lot of different directions. So the issue is not that the material is weak. The issue is that the story keeps holding too much of that material back. After almost 2 years, I think that is where the conflict starts feeling smaller than the world around it. But this is also why I still have a lot of hope for where the story goes next, because Wuthering Waves might be finally reaching the point where this can change. The biggest opportunity here is Phrolova. Depending on how they handle her return, she could change the entire dynamic of the antagonist side, because she can make that side of the conflict feel less uniform. That's what Wuthering Waves needs most. If she comes back and falls into the exact same role as before, then nothing really changes. And please, I really hope that's not what happens, since Phrolova is one of the few antagonists currently in the game who can genuinely shift the texture of the conflict. Through her, Fractsidus could start feeling like an organization with internal tension, different goals, different loyalties, different ways of pursuing the same larger objective. And with new Fractsidus characters entering the picture, this becomes even more important. They should not just be more names added to the enemy side, they should bring different functions. One antagonist can be loyal to the Grand Architect, another can pursue their own interests, another can clash with Phrolova, another can disrupt the group from within. That's how you make a one-track conflict feels more dynamic. You don't always need a completely new faction, sometimes you just need the existing faction to stop feeling like every piece is playing the same role. But Fractsidus should not be the only place where this change happens. The new Federation could also give Wuthering Waves a very different kind of conflict. Until now, most regions have followed the familiar pattern. Rover arrives, there is a problem, we meet the important people in power, eventually those people support us. Then we face the larger threat and move on. That structure is not bad, but it does become familiar. The new Federation has the chance to break that pattern. If this region is more cutthroat, more political or more hostile, then the region itself can become an antagonistic force, not evil, just resistant. A place where the institutions, leaders or culture itself pushes back against Rover instead of immediately aligning with them. That would already give the story something it badly needs, a different shape of conflict. And then there's the Threnodians. On paper, they should be one of the most terrifying forces in the story. Massive cosmic beings we still don't fully understand, strange, ancient, almost impossible to reduce to human conflict. But so far they often feel less like an antagonistic force of their own and more like pieces being moved around by the Grand Architect. And I understand why that works, it makes him feel dangerous. But if that's all they are, then it feels like a waste. The Threnodians could be an entirely different layer of conflict, something beyond Fractsidus, beyond politics, beyond human ambition. A force that does not just serve the antagonist side, but complicates it. That's really what I want from Wuthering Waves moving forward. More layers, more active antagonists, more conflict that does not always come from the same place. Because despite all of this criticism, Wuthering Waves is still my favorite gacha game. I love the world, I love how far the story has come since the beginning, I love the ideas sitting underneath the surface. That's exactly why I want the story to use more of what it already has, right now, in the present conflict. It does not need to rush the Grand Architect or reveal everything about Fractsidus. What it needs is more movement while we wait, more variety, more pressure, more antagonists who actively shape the story instead of only promising that something bigger is coming. And that's why this next phase of Wuthering Waves feels so important. Phrolova's return, the new Fractsidus characters, the new Federation, the Threnodians, all of this could make the conflict feel much more alive than it has felt so far, or they could fall into the same pattern again. That's the question I'm most interested in. Wuthering Waves already has the world, the characters and the lore, now it needs to make the conflict move. So what do you guys think? Do you think Wuthering Waves has handled its antagonist well so far, or do you also feel like the conflict has been too static? And with Phrolova returning, new Fractsidus characters showing up, and the new Federation coming into the picture, do you think the story is finally about to become more dynamic? Anyway, that's gonna be all from me for this one. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.